SADC, and as mandated by His Majesty King Mswati III of the Kingdom of Eswatini in his capacity as the incoming chairperson of the SADC organ on politics, defense, and security cooperation, it is my honor to welcome you to this important event of the release of the preliminary statement of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission SEOM on the conduct of the 16 September 2025 general election in the Republic of Malawi. The SEOM comprised 80 personnel drawn from 9 member states, namely the Republic of Botswana, the Kingdom of Eswatini, the Kingdom of Lesotho, the Republic of Mozambique, the Republic of Namibia, the Republic of South Africa, the United Republic of Tanzania, the Republic of Zambia, and the Republic of Zimbabwe. The mission observed the general election in all 28 districts of the Republic of Malawi from the 10th to the 17th of September 2025. The mission observed the 2025 general elections of the Republic of Malawi in line with the revised SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections 2021, hereinafter referred to as the SADC principles and guidelines, and the country's constitution, Electoral Commission Act Chapter 203, and the Presidential, Parliamentary, and Local Government Elections Act Number 10 of 2023. The SADC principles and guidelines provide an objective and scientific methodology for observing elections and contributing to the consolidation of democracy in the region by enhancing best electoral practices and recommending how to address any electoral shortcomings or challenges. The SADC principles and guidelines are also informed by critical instruments of the African Union, such as the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance 2007, and relevant conventions of the United Nations. This preliminary report covers the mission's observation of the pre-election, election, and post-election processes. The final report will be issued later and include our observations of the post-election processes, including the results management, announcement processes, and consequential matters. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to highlight the summary of SEOM. The SEOM engaged with the following stakeholders. First, representatives of the government of the Republic of Malawi. Second, the Malawi Electoral Commission, MAC. Number 3, SADC ambassadors, high commissioners, and other diplomatic missions accredited to the Republic of Malawi. Number 4, the Malawi Police Service. Number 5, political parties. Number 6, faith-based organizations. Number 7, civil society organizations and media organizations. The stakeholders were consulted in order to gather information on the electoral process. In that regard, the SIOM observed the following. Let me now deal with the political and security environment. The interaction with stakeholders provided an opportunity for the SIOM to understand the prevailing political environment and security situation in the Republic of Malawi. Most stakeholders with whom the mission engaged indicated that political and security environment was generally calm and peaceful, without violence or intimidation before, during, and immediately after the election. The mission observed free and peaceful campaign activities by political parties and independent candidates. The mission further observed the presence of security service members during campaign activities in most areas. Peace prevailed even in areas where the security services were not visible. This aligned with the SADC principles and guidelines, which require member states to ensure a peaceful environment to the holding of elections. However, the mission noted with concern reports of isolated pre-election incidents of tension and pockets of political violence in some districts, such as Kasungu, Mangochi, Nkotakota. Some stakeholders raised concerns about the alleged selective manner in which the Malawi Police Service have dealt with reported cases of political violence in the period before the deployment of our mission. Let me now proceed to focus on the management of the electoral process. With the exception of a few political parties, most stakeholders expressed satisfaction with the independence, professionalism, and preparedness of the MEC and their level of transparency and stakeholder engagement. Engagements with all sectoral electoral stakeholders indicated that the MEC was well prepared to deliver on its mandate for the 2025 general election. Furthermore, the mission noted that the MEC managed the process of nominating candidates in accordance with the law, and that the few disputes that arose were peacefully resolved through the appropriate courts. Notably, 2 candidates who had been disqualified were reinstated to the list of parliamentary candidates by court order, very close to the election day. Another area that SIOM looked at is the demarcation of constituencies and wards. The mission noted that in October 2022, the MEC published a report on the comprehensive review of constituency boundaries, the first of its kind since 1998. In this regard, the review resulted in the 2025 general election being conducted in 229 constituencies and 509 wards, as compared to 193 constituencies and 460 wards in the 2019 tripartite elections, thus improving democratic representation and the equality of the vote across the country. The number of polling stations also increased to 15,148 for the 2025 general election, as compared to 5,002 polling stations in the 2019 tripartite elections. It is the mission's view that this considerable increase in polling stations made the voting experience easier. These improvements align with the expectations outlined in the SADC principles and guidelines. Another area that SIOM looked at is voter registration. The mission observed that MEC implemented voter registration, supplementary voter registration, and the transfer of voters during this electoral cycle. As a result, a total of 7,202,756 voters were registered to vote, representing 65.7% of the projected eligible voting population of 10,957,490. Out of the total number of registered voters, 57% were females and 43% were males. The total number of registered voters for the 2025 general election surpassed the number of voters registered for the 2019 tripartite elections, which stood at 6,859,570. However, the mission noted that MEC did not achieve registration of the entire targeted population due to several factors. These include low voter education, disinformation from some opposition political parties that discouraged Malawians from registering to vote, a lack of national identification registration, and challenges to internet connectivity. The mission noted that to address these challenges, and also in compliance with an order of the High Court, the MEC conducted supplementary voter registration. The mission is of the view that the challenges faced in the voter registration could have been addressed with the introduction of continuous voter registration and a permanent voter's roll, which the MEC, to its credit, has previously recommended in the face of resistance from some political parties. SIOM also noted the issue of special voting. The mission noted that arrangements were made for polling staff, representatives of candidates and political parties, and officers from security agencies to vote at polling stations where they are deployed, regardless of where they were registered. The special voting was made possible by the amendment of the Presidential, Parliamentary and Local Government Elections Act in August of 2025, allowing categorized personnel to exercise their right to vote where they are deployed on election day, provided they have been verified as eligible. However, the mission noted that this amendment was made very late in the election cycle, leaving stakeholders and citizens a limited time to understand the implications as compared to the previous voting arrangements. As a result, some voters had the impression that they could vote at any polling station they chose, as long as they explained their circumstances to the presiding officer. It is worth noting that, as is the case for Malawi, some other member states have made amendments to their electoral laws late in the electoral cycle. Based on experiences from 2024, this appears to be a trend in the SADC region, and the SIOM has openly expressed its reservation when this has happened. Next, I would like to talk about the use of system and electronic management devices. The mission observed that the MEC planned to use an electronic system to transmit election results from tallying centers to the MEC's national tallying centers and devices for biometric verification of registered voters. The mission noted concerns of some stakeholders that the use of the system and devices may compromise the electoral process. The mission also noted the explanations that the use of the system and devices is intended to complement the provisions relating to the management of elections, particularly with regard to the transmission of results and verification of voters as contained in the Presidential, Parliamentary and Local Government Act. The mission noted that the use of the electronic system to transmit results of the general election and biometric voter verification devices was challenged through a petition lodged at the High Court of Malawi in Blantyre. On 11th September 2025, the High Court ruled that the use of election management devices aligns with legal and constitutional mandates, but required the MEC to receive manual results before the national announcement of results, which could be electronically transmitted concurrently with the manual results. This is to ensure transparency in the electoral process. The High Court also rejected an application made by petitioners for a special audit of the MEC electronic transmission system by political parties, as it would expose the system to tampering. The mission understands the importance of digitalizing the electoral process, but is of the view that the Malawi electoral law could be improved to provide clarity on the use of electronic systems, ensuring certainty and predictability in the electoral process. Now, the next issue that we looked at was diaspora voting. The mission noted that the Presidential, Parliamentary and Local Government Act does not cater for voting by Malawians in the diaspora. The SADC principles and guidelines encourage regular reviews of the participation of citizens in the diaspora in national elections. The mission considers voting in diaspora as the best practice to be incorporated into the electoral processes. Another area of note that SIOM looked at was the role of the judiciary. The SADC principles and guidelines require member states to uphold and guarantee impartiality and judicial independence. An impartial and independent judiciary is fundamental to the rule of law and, in the present context, to the civilized, peaceful, credible, and timely settlement of electoral disputes. The mission noted that despite their individual positions regarding the various disputes arising from this general election, all stakeholders in Malawi that the mission engaged with expressed their respect and high regard for how the judiciary in Malawi has continued to handle election-related disputes, which is very commendable and builds its credibility. We also looked at the role of the media. The SADC principles and guidelines require equal opportunities for all candidates and political parties to use the state media. The mission observed that the conduct of the media in Malawi is governed by the Communications Act number 34 of 2016. The mission received reports that the private media were relatively balanced in terms of communicating electoral messages and campaigns of political parties and independent candidates, except for paid party advertisements, which depended on the financial strength of the parties. Private radio stations aired political events across the country. Concerns were raised by some stakeholders about the biased coverage by the state-owned broadcaster during the current election period in favor of the ruling party. The mission is of the view that the Malawi Broadcasting Corporation should have done more to ensure equal coverage of campaign activities of all political parties in line with the provisions of the Communications Act. The Malawi Communication Regulatory Authority should also ensure that it provides a level playing field for all political parties on state-owned media platforms. This is not the first time that SIOM has made this observation. In 2019, the SIOM had this to say, and I quote, "While all political parties have the right to have their campaign messages reported on all media, there is an extra legal obligation on the Malawi Broadcasting Corporation, MBC, as a state-funded media outlet to maintain neutrality and ensure equal news coverage of all political parties in this respect." The mission observed that the MBC did not, however, provide neutral and equal news coverage for all political parties and candidates as required by law. End of quote. The mission also noted that there were isolated incidents where journalists' work was interfered with during political parties' nominations, conventions, and rallies. In addition, some social media platforms were used to spread misinformation and disinformation to citizens about the electoral process. Let me now focus on independent candidates. The mission observed that the Constitution allows for independent candidates to contest in the general elections. 5 independent candidates contested for the presidency. Out of 1,489 parliamentary candidates, 623 or 42% of the total were independent candidates. The figure is high compared to the 2019 tripartite elections, where 501 independent candidates made up 31% of the parliamentary candidates. The increase is partly due to contestations and the outcomes of political parties' primary elections. The mission also noted concerns raised that an independent candidate, having been elected, may join a political party. The Constitution only prohibits crossing the floor by parliamentarians who belong to a political party, but not by independent candidates. The mission is of the view that this position denies voters who elected an independent candidate the right to be represented without an alignment to or influence from a political party. Now let's move on to gender representation. The 2019-2025 Parliament had only 20.7% female members. In the context of the 2025 general election, the mission noted that although women account for 57% of registered voters in Malawi, they comprise only 22% of the candidates in the parliamentary election. And there's only one woman out of the 17 presidential candidates. On a positive note, 9 women were chosen as running mates to the presidential candidates. At the parliamentary level, female candidates were required to pay a nomination fee of 1.25 million kwacha, which is half of the 2.5 million kwacha that their male counterparts were required to pay. However, thank you. However, the proportion of women in elected offices remains very low and is a cause for concern. The mission awaits the results of the 2025 general election to determine if the number of elected women parliamentarians will even exceed the proportion achieved in 2019-2025 period and move in the direction expected by the SADC Protocol on Gender and Development and the SADC Principles and Guidelines in relation to the requirements to address the gender imbalance. Now let's look at the process itself. We'll start with the opening procedure. The opening procedure was observed at 28 polling stations. 31% of the observed polling stations opened on time, while 69% did not, due to delayed preparation, late arrival of a polling official, faults in the biometric verification devices, lack of knowledge on the part of polling officials, internet connectivity challenges, and resistance by voters on the use of the devices. The delays ranged from 1 to 30 minutes. At 96% of the observed polling stations, ballot boxes were shown to be empty before being sealed. At one polling station, the ballot boxes were not shown to be empty before sealing. At 61% of the polling stations observed, the voters' list was not displayed outside, while it was displayed outside 39% of the polling stations. At 14% of the polling stations observed, posters were present outside to educate voters on the voting process, while 86% of the polling stations observed, there were no such posters. At all the polling stations observed, representatives of political parties and independent candidates were able to perform their duties without interference or restrictions. In 96% of the polling stations observed, the environment was peaceful, while in 4% of the polling stations, the atmosphere was not conducive due to poor crowd control and chaotic queues. Security personnel were visibly present outside 96% of the polling stations observed. The voting procedures. The voting procedures were observed at 395 polling stations. The atmosphere and environment outside all the polling stations that were observed was peaceful. Security personnel, some of whom were armed, were visibly present at 99% of the polling stations. 99% of the polling stations observed were accessible to all voters, including persons with disabilities, the elderly, and pregnant women. The only exceptions were at 1% of the polling stations which were located on the hill, making it difficult to reach these categories of voters I've just mentioned. Voting progressed smoothly and orderly, and voting procedures were followed in all the polling stations observed. No irregularities were observed during the voting process in the polling stations observed. At 90% of the polling stations observed, all registered voters were allowed to cast their ballots. However, at 10% of the polling stations, some voters were not allowed to vote, mainly because they were at the wrong polling stations and did not have transfer forms or lacked voter identification cards. Almost all the polling stations observed were adequately laid out. At 64% of the polling stations observed, voters with disabilities, expectant mothers, and the elderly were given priority to cast their votes, while at 2% of the polling stations, such priority was not given. In 34% of the polling stations observed, no cases required such a priority. All those needing assistance to vote were held by a polling station officer or another registered voter of their choice. At all the polling stations observed, voters' identification documentation was checked against the available voters' roll. The average time taken to process a voter was 1 to 5 minutes, which is commendable considering the complexity of the voting procedures and the number of ballots. Political parties and candidates' representatives were present in 99% of the observed polling stations. Other international observers were present at 35% of the polling stations observed and were not observed at 65% of the polling stations. Local observers were present at 72% of the polling stations observed and were not present at 28% of the polling stations. Polling materials were available in sufficient quantities at all the polling stations that SIOM representatives, observers visited. Ballot boxes remained locked and sealed in all the polling stations during voting. The voting process continued uninterrupted at 99% of the polling stations observed. At 1% of the polling stations, voting was interrupted by heavy winds and an unruly representative of a political party. No formal complaint was lodged with the polling station officer in any of the polling stations observed. Now on closing procedures. Closing procedures were observed at 28 polling stations. Security personnel were visibly present in all the polling stations during the closing procedures. 31% of the polling stations observed closed on time, while 69% did not close on time, to compensate for the time lost by the delayed opening of the polling stations. At 86% of the polling stations observed, the polling station officer reconciled the number of used and spoiled ballot papers during the closing process, and the reconciliation took place in the presence of representatives from political parties and independent candidates. At 93% of the polling stations observed, an announcement was made regarding the reconciliation of the ballots cast. At 97% of the polling stations observed, minutes of the closing of the polling stations were completed. Political party and independent candidates' representatives were allowed to follow the closing procedures in all polling stations. The counting procedure and display of results. The mission observed the counting of votes in 27 polling stations. The following were observed. Counting took place at all polling stations observed. At all the polling stations observed, the political party and independent candidate representatives were present and allowed to observe counting procedures. At all polling stations observed, security personnel were present. At all the polling stations observed, the ballot boxes were still adequately locked and sealed, with serial numbers on the ballot box, sealed machine matching those at the start of the counting, as well as at the time of opening. At all polling stations observed, the counting process proceeded uninterrupted throughout. At 92% of the polling stations observed, the total number of ballot papers in the ballot boxes matched the total number of used ballot papers as previously announced, while in 8% of the polling stations, a ballot paper was missing in each of the 2 polling stations. At 93% of the polling stations observed, the voting stations were arranged in a manner that allowed for easy observation and counting. In 81% of the polling stations observed, there was adequate lighting, while in 19% of the polling stations, there was inadequate lighting due to a lack of electricity, insufficient gas light, and fewer torches. At all the polling stations observed, representatives of the political parties and independent candidates signed and received a copy of the results. At 74% of the polling stations observed, results were posted outside, while results were not posted at 26% of the polling stations. Now I will be looking at the SIOM recommendations. In light of the mission's observations and considering issues highlighted by various stakeholders, the SIOM recommends the following for the improvement of the electoral process in the Republic of Malawi. A, on political and security environment. The mission urges the government of the Republic of Malawi to ensure that law enforcement agencies in Malawi address reported criminal acts related to electoral activities. Then we look at the registration of voters. The mission urges the government of the Republic of Malawi to prioritize passing the necessary legal amendments to establish a continuous voter registration system, thereby improving voter registration opportunities and introducing a permanent electoral roll. The mission also urges the government, with the facilitation of MAC, to lead stakeholder consultation on reviewing the participation of citizens in the diaspora, with a view to considering the possibility of extending voter registration and voting rights to citizens in the diaspora. The mission further urges the government to consider amending the Presidential, Parliamentary and Local Government Elections Act to provide for a mandatory requirement for the publication of voters' lists outside polling stations before election day. Number 3, we looked at the use of electronic systems. The mission urges the government of the Republic of Malawi to consider amending the Presidential, Parliamentary and Local Government Elections Act to provide provisions on the use of electronic systems for electoral activities, including transmission of results. The role of the state and private media. The mission urges the government of the Republic of Malawi to consider regional and international best practices and implement measures to ensure that the Malawi Public Broadcasting Corporation provides impartial coverage of elections and political activity in Malawi in line with the Communications Act and the revised SADC principles and guidelines. On gender representation. The mission urges the government, political parties, and all stakeholders to adopt concrete measures to improve the proportion of women in elected political positions, particularly in Parliament. As I conclude, the CIOM observed that the pre-election and voting phases of the 2025 general election in the Republic of Malawi were generally conducted in a peaceful and orderly manner. The mission calls upon all stakeholders to continue and promoting the positives of peace, tolerance, and calm across all available platforms while the country awaits the final result of the 2025 general election. The mission also encourages all stakeholders to utilize relevant dispute settlement mechanisms as provided for in the laws of the Republic of Malawi in the event of any disagreements arising from the outcome of the general elections. In accordance with SADC principles and guidelines, the mission will issue the final report containing all findings and recommendations within 30 days of the issues of this preliminary statement. I thank you for your kind listening.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Themba Masuku, the head of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission to the 2025 general election here in Malawi, who is also the former Deputy Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Eswatini, for your statement. Just to indicate that the statement is available on our website, and also it's going to be distributed here using the QR code. So there's going to be a paper which is going to be shared to all delegates with a QR code. You can download the document directly from the QR code. Thank you very much. We proceed with the next presentation of the preliminary statement, and this is going to be delivered by His Excellency Haile Mariam Boshi, the former Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, who is heading the Joint African Union COMESA Electoral Observation Mission. Your Excellency, sir.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Head of the SADC Electoral Observation Mission, Head of the Electoral Commission's Forum, Election Observation Mission, Head of the African Center for Governance Election Observation Missions, Diplomatic Corps and International Community amongst us today, UN Resident Coordinator, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. This preliminary statement is only a summary of the main report, and the fuller version of the preliminary statement is available in our website, and you can refer it for detailed facts and figures. The African Union and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa deployed a joint observation mission, AU-COMESA EOM, to the 16th of September 2025 tripartite elections of the Republic of Malawi from 8 to 20 September 2025. The mission comprised 80 short-term observers from 26 African countries. Since arriving, the AU-COMESA EOM has engaged with Malawian stakeholders, including the Malawian Electoral Commission, political parties, civil society organizations, the media, faith-based groups, citizen observer networks, academia, and representatives of the international community. The mission deployed 24 teams who observed the voting and tallying at 340 polling stations. Based on our observations and interactions, we present our preliminary findings, noting that the electoral process is still ongoing. During our observations, we witnessed the vibrancy of Malawi democracy, underscored by strong institutions, competitiveness, and inclusive democracy. Based on the above, we acknowledge the following commendable practices. 1, the planning and preparations by the Malawian Electoral Commission, which included early announcement of the election calendar, increasing the number of electoral constituencies and wards following the boundary demarcation, and reducing the voter threshold per polling station to 600 to allow for effective voter management and avoiding congestion is commendable. Disposal of electoral-related petitions by the Judiciary well before the elections, and the commendable independence of the Judiciary, which has given confidence on the process by the Malawian people. 3, Coordinated Election Situation Room, ESRS, an initiative which enhanced transparency and accountability of the electoral process by civil society, is commendable. 4, the signing of a peace pledge by presidential candidates, which demonstrated commitment to peaceful process and collegial environment demonstrated by party agents at the polling stations, is also commendable. 5, the establishment of the Joint Election Security Task Force coordinated, maintained order and safeguarded the process with adequate professionalism. 6, the self-funding of the election process by the Malawian government is commendable. 7, voters' enthusiasm and commitment on election day, despite the hot weather and delays in starting voting in majority of the voting stations, is also commendable. 8, extensive media coverage of the electoral process contributed to visibility and public awareness. And finally, regular consultations and updates by the Malawian Electoral Commission, which enhanced stakeholders' confidence in the process. While Malawi has demonstrated progress, electoral stakeholders should consider the following. 1, the absence of continuous voter registration may have impacted negatively on the number of registered voters and should be looked into. 2, while nomination fees were reduced for youth and women and persons with disabilities, these groups remain underrepresented in candidate lists, and the validity of these fees and the potential impediment it has on candidates' participation has to be scrutinized. 3, unbalanced media coverage, especially by the state broadcaster MBBC, has to be improved. Based on its observations, the mission proposes the following initial recommendations. 1, introduce legislated gender quotas or temporary special measures to guarantee a minimum threshold of women's representation and require political parties to support
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, the head of the Joint African Union COMESA Electoral Observation Mission, for your statement. Just to remind members of the delegations and all others present here that these statements are going to be posted on the respective websites and official pages, social media pages of the missions. Just also to indicate that this session is being broadcast live on Facebook page of SADC. We are going to proceed with the proceedings now with the presentation by the head of the African Center for Governance, Electoral Observation Mission, Her Excellency Honorable Lindiwe Zulu. Your Excellency, Madam.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I will observe all the already observed protocol, but of course I will single out the Honorable Themba Nhlanganiso Masuku and His Excellency Haile Mariam Desalegn Boshe, who's just departed because of a flight, Honorable Justice Barnabas Nyamadzabo. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our preliminary report. The African Center for Governance deployed its electoral observation mission to the Republic of Malawi ahead of the 16th of September 2025 general elections, following an invitation from the Malawi Electoral Commission, popularly known as MEC. The mission was led by myself, Lindiwe Zulu. The ACG comprised 29 short-term election observers drawn from regional governance institutions, civil society organizations, academic institutions, media, gender and human rights experts. The mission reflected ACG's commitment to advancing democratic resilience, inclusive governance, and human rights across the African continent. The objective of the ACG was to assess the conduct of the 2025 general elections in Malawi's national legal framework, regional instruments such as the SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections, and the continental standards including the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, the African Charter on Human Rights, Human and People's Rights, and other relevant international norms. Prior to deployment, ACG held two-day briefing and orientation sessions from the 11th to the 12th September 2025, equipping observers with contextual analysis, electoral procedures, and observation methodology. The mission also engaged with key stakeholders, including the Malawi Electoral Commission, political parties, civil society organizations, security agencies, media representatives, domestic observer groups, and international partners. On election day, ACG deployed 14 teams across 14 districts to observe critical phases of the electoral process, including the opening of polling stations, voting procedures, closing, and initial counting. The preliminary statement represents the mission's initial findings and assessment of the electoral process as observed on the 16th of September 2025. This statement provides a preliminary assessment of key observations and emerging trends grounded in direct field report and stakeholder consultations. Recognizing that electoral processes remain ongoing, including the tabulation of results and resolution on any disputes, this statement does not constitute ACG's final assessment. A comprehensive report with detailed findings and recommendations will be released within a month of the official announcements of results, aimed at strengthening future electoral processes in Malawi and the region. Political context of the elections. Since transition to multi-party democracy in 1994, Malawi has held regular elections with power alternating between major political parties. The 2025 elections unfolded within a politically charged environment shaped by persistent economic hardship, economic frustration, fuel crisis, and growing demands for better livelihoods. Youth unemployment, corruption allegations, and really regional disparities in development featured prominently in campaign narratives. The ACG-EOM observed that while political competition remained robust, the pre-election campaign period was marked by isolated incidents of political violence. The campaign period was peaceful, with isolated reports of voter buying conveyed by the electorate. The legal framework. The legal framework governing the 2025 general election in Malawi is anchored in the Constitution of the Republic of Malawi and operationalized through the Presidential, Parliamentary and Local Government Elections Act. This act outlines key procedures for the conduct of elections, including the roles and responsibilities of MEC, voter registration, nomination of candidates, polling, counting and declaration of results. Additional legislation relevant to the electoral process includes Political Parties Act, the Electoral Commission Act, and provision under the Gender Equality Act and Disability Act, which affirms Malawi's commitment to inclusive participation. The legal framework also recognizes all fundamental rights in Malawi's obligation under regional and international instruments, including the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and the SADC Principles and Guidelines governing democratic elections. The ACG-EOM notes that while Malawi's legal framework is broadly aligned with continental and international standards, gaps remain in implementation, particularly in ensuring gender-responsive and disability-inclusive electoral practices, as well as addressing the gaps in campaign financing. Litigation. Some electoral-related cases have been concluded, whilst others remain pending. Based on our assessment and engagement with stakeholders, all pending cases may not affect the credibility or integrity of the electoral process. The judiciary and relevant institutions have continued to handle these matters with professionalism and transparency. On electoral system, Malawi's electoral system is structured around a tripartite model enabling citizens to simultaneously elect the president, members of the National Assembly, and local government councillors. The presidential elections follows a two-round system introduced after the 2019 annual results and reaffirmed by the Constitutional Court in 2020. Under this system, a candidate must secure more than 50% of valid votes to win outright, failing which a runoff between the top two contenders is held within 30 days. Members of the National Assembly are elected from single-member constituencies using a first-past-the-post system. Following a nationwide elimination exercise, the number of parliamentary seats increased from 193 to 229, reflecting population growth and accessibility concerns. Local government elections involve the selection of 509 councillors across district councils and city assemblies, also through a first-past-the-post system. While officially non-partisan, these contests often mirror national party dynamics and are shaped by local service delivery issues. The ACG-EOM notes that while Malawi's electoral system provides a clear framework for representative governance, the two-round presidential and model enhances legitimacy, but also demands robust logistical capacity and civil education to ensure meaningful participation in both rounds. Election administration. The ACG-EOM observed that, in accordance with Malawi's legal framework, the Malawi Electoral Commission undertook a series of preparatory activities ahead of 2025 general elections. These included the nationwide voter registration exercise, voter and civic education campaigns, nomination of candidates and political parties, and the establishment of polling stations across all districts. The mission noted that MEC demonstrated commendable operational capacity in managing logistical arrangement, training polling staff, and deploying materials in a timely manner. That the government of Malawi provided the full budget for the presidential, parliamentary, and local elections. With regard to voter registration, Malawi has a population of approximately 20 million with an estimated 10.9 million eligible voters. At the time of the African Center for Government's pre-election assessment, the collection of voter registration statistics by gender and other classifications such as youth and persons with disabilities was still being finalized. The Malawi Electoral Commission initially set a target of registering 10.9 eligible voters. However, following the completion of the voter registration exercise, MEC recorded 7.200,905 registered voters. According to MEC, the registered voter base comprises 3.087563 males, which means it's 42.9%, and 4.113, females, which represents 57.1%. With regard to political party and candidate nominations, the political party and candidates nomination process for Malawi's 2025 general elections unfolded smoothly. The MEC managed the exercise with commendable professionalism, transparency, and integrity, ensuring that all political parties were accorded fair and consistent treatment. 17 presidential candidates cleared to contest. Over 2,000 parliamentary aspirants, including 737 independents, filling nominations across 229 constituencies. The process was characterized by orderly submissions, rigorous vetting, and adherence to legal framework, reinforcing public confidence in MEC's institutional capacity. While some parties navigated internal disputes and logistical hurdles, the overall conduct reflected Malawi's commitment to credible and inclusive elections. With regard to elections campaign and campaign finance, the 2025 elections campaign in Malawi was conducted peacefully, with political parties and candidates largely adhering to principles of tolerance and non-violence. Malawi's Political Parties Act of 2018 provides for state funding to parties securing at least 10% of the national vote in parliamentary elections. However, concern remains about the transparency and fairness in the allocation of these funds. Whilst this provision exists in law, its implementation has been questionable. In previous years, eligible parties receiving funding without clear regulation or transparency mechanism, leading to concerns about misuse and lack of accountability. With regard to inclusion in the electoral process, gender, women constituted the majority of registered voters in the 2025 general elections, reflecting strong participation at the grassroots level. However, ACG-SIOM noted persistent barriers to equal representation in political leadership, particularly at parliamentary and local levels. Of the 17 presidential candidates, only one woman, underscoring the gender imbalance in high-level political contexts. Structural and social cultural constraints continue to limit women's access to nomination platforms, campaign financing, and party leadership roles. With regard to the youth, the Malawi Electoral Commission demonstrated commendable commitment to youth inclusion through targeted civil education campaign and the recruitment of unemployed youth as polling staff. Political parties also nominated a notable number of young candidates, signaling a gradual shift towards generational representation. However, youth voter apathy remains a concern, driven by persistent disillusionment with political promises and limited economic opportunities. Voters with special needs. The MEC made notable efforts to support voters with disability, including individuals with visual, hearing, speech and mobility impairment. On election day, many polling stations demonstrated a commitment to inclusive participation through implementation of varied across districts, with some lacking adequate infrastructure and trained personnel. With regard to the media environment, Malawi's media environment is largely free, with open coverage of electoral events. Even so, some stakeholders have raised concern about the disproportionate airtime for the ruling party campaign on state media. Social media platforms, especially Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, have emerged as influential space for political discourse and voter engagement. The use of social media influencers and popular pages being used to steer public opinion has also been noted. The role of civil society organizations. Civil society organizations continue to play an indispensable role in Malawi's electoral process, driving voter education, election monitoring, and advocacy for inclusive participation. Through strategic collaboration with MEC, CSOs extended outreach to rural and underserved communities, helping bridge critical gaps in civil awareness and engagement. Despite persistent resource constraints, these organizations have demonstrated remarkable resilience and professionalism, reinforcing democratic accountability and ensuring that marginalized voices are not left behind. Our experience also of seeing these organizations at the Situation Room was very encouraging, something very new, and we think that this should be encouraged. Voting, special voting. Malawi does not currently provide for special voting arrangement for military personnel, police officers, correctional service staff, or citizens in the diaspora. The Presidential, Parliamentary and Local Government Elections Act limits voter registration and polling to gazetted constituencies within Malawi borders, requiring an eligible voter to be physically present to register and cast their vote. The ACG-EOM noted that this restriction effectively excludes Malawians living abroad from participating in the 2025 general elections unless they return home to register and vote. While MEC announced the registration timelines well in advance to allow for travel planning, the absence of legal provision for diaspora voting, postal ballots, or early voting remains a significant barrier to inclusive participation. Opening of polling station. Most polling stations opened on time with essential materials in place and transparent setup procedures. Minor logistical issues such as crowd management were isolated and did not disrupt the process. Presence of party agents and observers. Most polling stations had party agents and accredited observers present. In a few cases, late arrivals or temporary absences during key procedures highlighted the need for consistent and timely participation of all stakeholders. With regard to security arrangement, security personnel were visibly present and well coordinated across all polling stations that we observed, helping maintain order and manage crowd effectively. With regard to voter identification and verification, the voter verification process was largely smooth. In isolated cases of technical glitches or missing or incorrect documentation, manual methods were used to accommodate affected voters. While this flexibility promoted inclusion, it highlighted the need for consistent contingency planning to ensure uniformity in all polling stations. With regard to accessibility, the needs of persons with disability, the elderly, pregnant women, and nursing mothers, among other special needs groups, were not fully accommodated by the choices of polling stations used. For example, the waiting process for such groups was long, and there were no seating arrangements made for these groups. Voters turned away. Most polling stations followed verification procedures, though some voters with incorrect cards were allowed to vote after alternative identity checks. Voters who went to wrong voting stations were redirected, and hopefully when they were redirected, they got there on time. Although this flexibility promoted inclusion, it revealed inconsistencies that underscore the need for clear, transparent protocols as well as maximum voter education. Ballot secrecy. Ballot secrecy was generally upheld through proper booth setup, though assisted voting compromised confidentiality in some areas. Ballot issuance and marking were efficient and clear, enabling voters to participate freely. Vote casting proceeded smoothly across polling stations, contributing to a calm environment. Assisted voting, however, lacked consistent safeguards, raising concern about undue influence and procedural integrity. Ballot box integrity. Ballot boxes were properly sealed before voting began and after polls closed, ensuring procedural integrity. Their placement remained visible and secure throughout the day, allowing for public oversight. No incidences of tampering or suspicious activity were detected at any of the polling stations that we observed. Closing and counting. Polling stations closed on time except where earlier delays occurred, with proper handling of remaining voters and secure sealing of materials. Voter counting was smooth and followed legal procedures. Incident reporting, that's our last. Some reports emerged as politicians campaigning at the polling station, raising concern about procedural breaches. Most disputes were handled calmly on site, with polling officials providing guidance. Observers were generally treated respectfully, though in some cases media personnel attempted to restrict their movement in one of the polling stations where we observed. The last is with regard to our recommendations. To MEC, our mission commends MEC for readiness and adequate preparation and should continue to do so in future elections. We commend the MEC for regular briefing that have been consistent and transparent. These have contributed to a climate of trust and readiness. Future elections should adopt the same approach to avoid anxiety. We commend MEC for adopting election technology and managing it well, making the elections day a success. We encourage MEC to integrate human rights standards into electoral planning. MEC should embed the rights to health, dignity and accessibility into phases of elections preparation and execution. This includes ensuring adequate shelter, water, sanitation and well-equipped medical support services at polling stations. We encourage MEC to develop well-inclusive electoral infrastructure by prioritizing voting facilities that accommodate the sensitive needs of pregnant women, nursing mothers, persons with disability, and the elderly. We encourage MEC to ensure that voters, especially in rural areas, are equipped to engage with digital tools through targeting, training, and outreach. We encourage MEC to develop clear protocols for data privacy, audit trails and public reporting to minimize disinformation on the work of its commission. We encourage MEC to conduct post-election review of digital tools to assess impact, refine system, and continue to embed technology into long-term electoral reform strategies. We encourage MEC to adopt targeted special voting measures to ensure full participation of groups often excluded. And with regard to civil society, we encourage civil society to establish independent monitoring mechanism to detect and deter transactional campaigning and vote buying, especially in economically distressed regions. Launch voter education campaigns that link economic justice to democratic participation, empowering citizens to resist coercive tactics and demand accountability. To advocate for social protection and measures ensuring elections period to reduce susceptibility to exploitation, particularly in rural and farming communities. Facilitate community dialogues and media campaigns that address voter anxieties, clarify electoral processes, and result in trust in the institutions. Effectively track inflammatory speech and disinformation that may destabilize the election environment. Institutionalize regular coordination forum to sustain collaboration beyond the electoral period. And with regard to the judiciary, we encourage the judiciary to finalize all pending electoral-related cases timely. And lastly, to government, we encourage the government to take urgent steps to insulate the electoral process from corrosive effects of poverty, food insecurity, and transactional politics. This includes strengthening anti-voter buying laws, regulating campaign financing to empower voters. The right to vote cannot be divorced from the broader socio-economic context and cannot be enjoyed in isolation. The government should prioritize policies that improve livelihoods, ensuring that electoral processes are not vulnerable to economic exploitation. The African Center for Government Election Observation Mission expresses its sincere gratitude to the MEC for the invitation and subjecting itself to scrutiny, which demonstrated its openness to democratic and governance values. The ACG is also grateful to all electoral stakeholders who shared their insights and experiences, which made this mission a success. And our statement will also be found. There will be a QR code that will be distributed so that people can access our report. We wish to thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Honorable Lindiwe Zulu, the head of the Africa Governance Center, Electoral Observation Mission, for your preliminary statement. We are going to the last preliminary statement, which is going to be delivered by the Honorable Justice Barnabas Nyamadzao, head of the Electoral Commissions Forum. Your Excellency, this is your time.
Thank you, Director of Ceremonies. In the interest of time, I will stand by the established protocol. By way of introduction, the Electoral Commissions Forum of SADC countries of member states of SADC was formed in July 1998 and comprises of 15 electoral commissions of SADC member states. The mandate of the forum, amongst others, is to strengthen cooperation amongst member electoral commissions, as well as promote conditions conducive to credible and transparent elections in the SADC region. Basically, this mission is a technical observer mission. So, like other missions, we were invited by the Malawi Electoral Commission, which is also a member of this forum. The forum deployed a short-term observer mission to the general elections to the Republic of Malawi, held on the 16th of September 2025. The mission is by me, and I'm deputized in this mission by the chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission of Malawi. The mission had 24 members from 9 member commissions from Angola, the DRC, IC Botswana, Lesotho, Eswatini, Namibia, Zambia, IC South Africa, and Zimbabwe. The ECF SADC short-term election observation mission to Malawi is from the 7th of September and will be ending tomorrow, the 19th of September. Teams were deployed from the 14th of September 2025 to cover the central and southern regions of Malawi. The reasons why we have only central and southern regions is because we have a very small mission. They made pre-poll visits to their assigned areas to establish the readiness of a MEC in the pre-election period, election day, and also the post-electoral processes. The team remained in the regions until the 17th of September 2025. So basically, this will be a summary of our preliminary statement, which will also be posted on our Facebook page. And also we have a few hard copies which delegates can collect after this session. So now I'll go to the pre-election mission activities. The ECF SADC undertook a pre-election assessment mission to Malawi from the 4th to the 8th of June 2025. In light of its observations during the pre-elections period, the mission made administrative recommendations for consideration by MEC in the build-up to these elections. Now, we also had engagement with Malawi Electoral Commission, and I will summarize what we did when we engaged with Malawi Electoral Commission. The mission during its engagement with the Malawi Electoral Commission went to its warehouse in Lilongwe and also went to Constituency Tally Center to get a picture as to the readiness of Malawi Electoral Commission to undertake these elections. We also noted good practice from Malawi or MEC that it regularly updated stakeholders on its readiness to conduct these elections. We also had engagements with other electoral stakeholders. The mission met several electoral stakeholders, including the Malawi Police Service, the Non-Governmental Regulatory Authority, NGORA, civil society organizations, as well as academia, and also some political parties. The stakeholders highlighted certain areas of concern, being the underrepresentation of women and youth as candidates in these elections. The stakeholders also mentioned technical innovations which were being carried out in the context of challenging mobile network. The stakeholders also complained or raised concerns about the spread of false information on mobile platforms. The stakeholders also complained of inadequate civic and voter education by civil society organizations, perceived selective application of law by the police in opposition cycles, and also despite the concerns by stakeholders, all of them were happy that MEC would conduct these elections effectively. Now, key mission observations, we have divided this into pre-polling phase, The pre-polling phase was generally peaceful. The final political rallies, as reported, were found to be peaceful. The accreditation of both local and international observers by MEC was done ahead of elections. MEC was also open to engage with various electoral stakeholders in the electoral arena. Regarding polling day observations, the mission observed polling in 76 polling centers with 308 polling stations visited in the central and southern regions of Malawi. Polling stations personnel were at polling stations well ahead of starting time. Polling stations visited had received their voting materials before election day and had adequate materials for the day. Most polling stations visited started on time, save those that encountered administrative or technical challenges. Most of the polling stations visited had long queues of voters, especially in the mornings, but were effectively managed. Biometric voter verification machines worked well during the day in many polling stations which we visited, but with isolated reports of glitches and network connectivity challenges. There were generally more women than men as polling staff. Domestic and international observers were also generally well received. Security personnel was also found to be there, to be present at all polling stations that we visited. We also noted that elderly people, expected mothers, persons with disabilities were given a priority to vote. Political party and also candidate monitors were present at all the polling stations that the missions or teams visited. Polling stations were accessible to persons with disabilities. Now, regarding the closing, counting and management of results, procedures were generally followed for closing, counting, with the following observations being made. That election results forms were duly signed by polling staff and polling party and candidate monitors, with copies being given to the monitors and also others being posted at the polling stations. Now, lessons learned and also best practices from these elections. MEC had taken into consideration a number of the administrative recommendations that SADC Observer Mission made to MEC in the 2019 general elections. We also noticed that there was a robust communications strategy provided, which very timely information and also updates that enhance the electoral openness. Decentralized warehousing, distribution of election materials ahead of election day, enhanced availability of election material on the day of the poll. The inclusion of informal dialogue fora, such as the NACOF, enhanced political engagement. A speedy accreditation process to observers was also found to be a good practice. Technical innovations enhance integrity, but this should be implemented to 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. Medication regalia for its officials to enable stakeholders to identify them by roles so that people can know who is a presiding officer, who is an in-person, and all those things. Legislative review on timeframes relating to dispute resolution, i.e. relating to cases before MEC and also before the courts. Electoral law reviews should be done early in the electoral cycle, and that review of timelines for inspection of the voters' roll, and also provide mechanisms for objections to the content of the voters' roll. So in conclusion, the mission also congratulates the people of Malawi on the manner in which they conducted themselves during the electoral period. Contesting parties and also independent candidates are commended for their tolerance and restraint during the electoral process. The mission acknowledges the professionalism and also the tremendous efforts and commitment of MEC, and that the electoral process is still ongoing, and that the mission encourages the people of the Republic of Malawi to remain patient and peaceful as they await the outcome of the election results. With that summary, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Justice, Head of the Electoral Commission, ECF, Head of ECF Electoral Observation Mission, for your preliminary statement. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we're coming towards the end of this session, but as per our long-standing tradition, when the heads of mission have presented their preliminary statements, we offer opportunity to members of the media and also stakeholders who are present here to ask some questions or seek clarification based on the statements that have been made. This is the time to do that. So we'll ask if there is anyone from the media and also from our stakeholders who are present here who would like to ask a question to any of the electoral observer mission present here. They should do so at this point. My colleagues have got microphones in the audience. You raise your hand, identify yourself by indicating the media house you're representing or an